Hello, dear listeners. Today you will hear a story about how a city's protector faces a terrifying threat. A ghost from her own classified past, turned weaponized against everything she holds dear. By the way, write in the comments which city you are from. We're very curious to know. Now sit back and enjoy the story. The signature was unmistakable. Not a fingerprint, not a DNA trace, but a whisper from a forgotten file. A ghost from my own tactical playbook. It hung in the air, acrid and metallic, amidst the debris of what used to be the city's oldest municipal archive. A message, delivered with surgical precision, designed not to kill, but to terrify. I'd seen this before, or rather, I'd designed it to be seen. But not like this. Not here, not now. My office, if you could call it that, was a cluttered testament to a life deliberately unglamorous. Stacks of cold case files, half-empty coffee mugs, and a perpetually flickering fluorescent light above my desk. Dr. Aris Thorne, forensic profiler. The title felt like a poorly fitting uniform, a civilian disguise for someone who once navigated the labyrinthine corridors of top-secret military psychology. I'd traded the sterile, high-stakes environment of classified projects for the grimy, often heartbreaking reality of local crime. It was a penance, perhaps, or a desperate attempt at normalcy. Most days, it was just work, until the bombings started. The first one hit the financial district, a controlled detonation that shattered windows but left the structural integrity of the buildings largely intact. No casualties, but the market plummeted. The second, a week later, targeted a major transportation hub during rush hour. Again, miraculously only minor injuries, but the city ground to a halt, choked by fear and gridlock. Then came the archive. This wasn't about money or infrastructure. This was about something else entirely. The police were baffled. Detective Miller, a man whose skepticism was as thick as his mustache, had called me in for the archive bombing. He'd worked with me on a few cold cases, grudgingly admitting my unconventional insights sometimes paid off. He stood across from me, arms crossed, the scent of stale coffee and frustration radiating from him. "Another ghost, Thorne?" he grunted, gesturing at the crime scene photos spread across my desk. "This one leaves a hell of a mess for a ghost." I traced the scorch marks in the image, the oddly specific pattern of destruction. "It's not about the mess, Miller. It's about the message." FBI Agent Davies, a sharp-suited federal presence who viewed local profilers as a necessary nuisance, had already dismissed my initial observations. "Dr. Thorne, with all due respect, we're looking for a bomber, not a poet. We have no demands, no manifesto, no clear motive. This isn't some elaborate performance art." He was wrong. It was a performance, meticulously staged. The lack of fatalities was deliberate, a chilling masterstroke. It wasn't about physical destruction. It was about psychological disruption. The carefully chosen targets, the timing, the almost theatrical precision of the blasts. It was all designed to maximize panic and uncertainty, to erode public trust, to make people question the very ground beneath their feet. I remembered a briefing years ago in a windowless room deep underground. The discussion had been about soft targets and psychological impact matrices. A chill ran down my spine. "Have you considered the absence of a clear motive as a motive in itself, Agent Davies?" I asked, my voice betraying none of the unease coiling in my gut. "This isn't about what they want. It's about what they want us to feel." I picked up a fragment of charred paper from the archive site, a piece of a historical document, its edges singed but the text still legible. A fragment about civic duty and collective memory. The bomber hadn't just destroyed records, they'd symbolically attacked the city's identity. This was an attack on the mind, not just the body. Miller just grunted, but Davies raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something beyond dismissiveness in his eyes. He'd seen enough to know conventional wisdom wasn't cutting it. I spent the next few days immersed in the details, sifting through the debris, the witness statements, the frantic media coverage. My unique insight, as Miller called it, came from a place I desperately tried to forget. I'd spent years deconstructing human psychology, designing methods to influence and disrupt, to create precisely this kind of pervasive, untraceable fear. My military past wasn't just a shadow, it was a blueprint. The bombings were a conversation, a one-sided dialogue with a city held hostage. Each blast was a carefully constructed sentence, designed to echo in the collective consciousness. The perpetrator wasn't just planting explosives, they were planting ideas, doubts, anxieties. And the language they were using felt unsettlingly familiar. A brief anecdote from my current civilian profiling work, analyzing a serial arsonist's choice of targets, flashed through my mind. The arsonist wasn't after property. He was after specific emotional responses from his victims. This bomber was operating on a grander, more terrifying scale. I remembered a conversation with Dr. Elias Vance, my former colleague from the project. He'd always pushed the boundaries, arguing that the greatest weapon wasn't a bomb, but the fear of one. His words, once theoretical, now seemed to be playing out in real time on the city streets. I dismissed the thought. Vance was gone, the project buried. But the methodology was alive and well. The city was on edge. Every siren, every unexpected loud noise sent a ripple of anxiety through the population. People avoided crowded places, public transport was half empty, and the once bustling cafes were quiet. The psychological impact was undeniable, exactly as I would have predicted if I had been designing such a campaign. I found myself reviewing old, unclassified papers on influence operations, my fingers tracing diagrams of psychological impact curves. It was a chilling exercise, like reading a textbook after witnessing its theories enacted on a grand scale. The official reports from the FBI focused on forensics, on blast patterns, on potential materials. But I was looking at the negative space, the absence of conventional clues, the deliberate misdirection. The bomber was a ghost, leaving no physical trace, only psychological scars. And that, more than anything, screamed of a specific kind of training, a specific kind of mind. My mind. I pushed the thought away, but it clung to me, a cold, damp cloth. I was a civilian now, a profiler, not a weapon designer. But the tools I'd helped forge, the tactics I'd once honed, were now being wielded by an unseen hand. The thought was a constant hum beneath the surface of my consciousness, a quiet dread that grew louder with each passing day. The mundane aspects of my current life, the paperwork, the budget requests, the endless bureaucratic hurdles, felt like a thin veil over a much darker reality. I remembered a particularly brutal boot camp exercise, designed to break down recruits' sense of security, to make them question their own perceptions. This bomber was doing the same thing, but to an entire city. There was no glory in this, no heroism, just a cold, calculated terror. Miller called again, his voice tight. Another incident. A minor explosion at a local park near a children's playground. Again, no serious injuries, but the message was clear. Nowhere was safe. The city was a chessboard, and the bomber was playing a game only I seemed to understand. The fear in the city was palpable. You could taste it in the air, see it in the wary eyes of strangers. It was a manufactured fear, a weaponized anxiety, and it was working perfectly. I felt a growing sense of responsibility, a personal stake in this that went beyond my professional duty. This wasn't just another case. This was a mirror reflecting a past I thought I'd buried. I stared at the crime scene photos again, the subtle details, the deliberate choices. The signature was unmistakable, a whisper from a forgotten file, a ghost from my own tactical playbook. The phone rang again, pulling me from my reverie. It was Davies. His voice, usually clipped and formal, held a new urgency. Dr. Thorne, we just received a message, encrypted, anonymous. It's not a demand, not a threat. It's a riddle about the nature of fear. He sounded genuinely rattled. I felt a cold certainty settle over me. This wasn't just a bomber. This was someone playing a very specific, very personal game, and I was the only one who knew the rules. I hung up, the receiver cold in my hand. The riddle, no doubt, would be couched in the language of psychological operations, a challenge designed to test my understanding, to draw me out. The city held its breath, waiting for the next strike, the next ripple of fear. But I knew better. This wasn't just about the city anymore. This was about me. My past was no longer just a memory. It was an active threat, a weapon in the hands of an unknown enemy. The city held its breath, but Aris knew this was just the overture. The real terror lay in the echoes she was beginning to hear, echoes that sounded disturbingly like her own voice. Every explosion wasn't just a blast, it was a question, echoing a strategy I'd once designed to break minds, not buildings. The city was still reeling from the downtown market bombing, a chaotic ballet of shattered glass and panicked screams. But it wasn't the physical damage that gnawed at Aris Thorne, it was the precision of the fear, the calculated disruption of routine, the subtle psychological footprint left behind. She sat in her cramped office, the scent of stale coffee and old paper a familiar comfort, surrounded by crime scene photos and intelligence reports. Detective Miller had reluctantly provided them, his skepticism a palpable weight in the room, even in his absence. Agent Davies, predictably, had sent only official summaries, scrubbed clean of anything that might hint at an unconventional mind at work. But Aris didn't need their interpretations. She had her own. Her fingers traced the blast patterns, the seemingly random timing, the choice of targets, not government buildings or military installations, but places of public gathering, symbols of normalcy. A commuter hub during rush hour, a local park on a Sunday afternoon, now the bustling market. Each attack designed to erode trust, to foster a pervasive sense of vulnerability. This wasn't about body count. It was about demoralization. It was about creating an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom that could strike at will. This was the core tenet of psychological warfare, a discipline she knew intimately, the meticulous breakdown of the bombing's psychological effects, the ripple of fear through the population, the erosion of public confidence. It was all too familiar. The perpetrator wasn't just planting bombs. They were planting seeds of doubt, cultivating a harvest of anxiety. The aha moment hit her like a physical blow, a cold dread seeping into her bones. The signature wasn't just similar, it was hers. Or rather, it was a distorted echo of Project Chimera, the classified program she'd helped design decades ago. She remembered the sterile, windowless rooms, the hushed voices, the endless flowcharts detailing pathways to societal disruption, to cognitive dissonance. Dr. Elias Vance, her former colleague, his brilliant mind often clouded by ambition, had been a driving force. They'd envisioned it as a shield, a way to understand and counteract enemy influence operations. But in the wrong hands, it was a weapon. She closed her eyes, a vivid flashback to the early days of Chimera. The initial purpose, noble enough, to understand the mechanisms of societal resilience and vulnerability. The ethical tightrope they walked, justifying every simulation, every theoretical manipulation, as a necessary evil for national security. Vance, with his persuasive arguments, had always pushed the boundaries, always found a way to rationalize the next step, no matter how morally ambiguous. His words, "We must know the darkness to fight it," still haunted her. The present-day investigation felt like a frustrating dead end for law enforcement. Miller's team was chasing shadows, conventional motives, while the perpetrator moved with an almost surgical detachment, always one step ahead. The media, of course, was in a frenzy, amplifying the fear, unwittingly playing into the perpetrator's hands. Aris saw it all as a carefully orchestrated symphony of terror, each note designed to resonate with specific psychological triggers. She saw a news report, a distraught mother clutching her child, talking about how safe she used to feel. That was the goal, to shatter that feeling. Her internal conflict was a raging storm, guilt for what she had created, intertwined with the desperate need to stop its weaponization. How could she have been so naive, so arrogant to think she could control such power? She remembered a specific simulation, Operation Siren, designed to induce widespread paranoia through carefully disseminated, subtly contradictory information. It had been theoretical then, a series of algorithms and psychological profiles. Now, she saw its chilling reality playing out on the evening news. The perpetrator was using her playbook, updated for a hyper-connected world. A junior analyst, Sarah, eager but inexperienced, brought her a new set of data. Traffic camera footage, cell tower pings, all leading to a dead end in a forgotten industrial district. They just vanish, Dr. Thorne, Sarah said, her voice laced with frustration. It's like they're ghosts. Aris looked at the map, at the seemingly random points of disappearance. Not random, deliberate. A method she'd lectured on, a technique for creating psychological blind spots in surveillance, using predictable human behavior against itself. The perpetrator wasn't vanishing, they were simply moving through the city in a way designed to be overlooked, to be dismissed as noise. It was a classic Chimera tactic, noise as camouflage. Sarah was a decent analyst, but she lacked the context, the deep, troubled knowledge Aris possessed. Aris felt a growing fear, a cold certainty that this wasn't just an attack on the city. It was an attack on her, a personal challenge from someone who knew her work intimately. Someone who had either been part of Chimera or had gained access to its highly classified methodologies. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The bombings weren't just about terror, they were about a message, a declaration of intent, delivered with her own intellectual property. The weight of it was crushing. She was not just profiling a criminal, she was confronting a dark reflection of her own past, a ghost that had learned to walk. She leaned back, the fluorescent lights of her office humming above her, a stark contrast to the shadowy memories swirling in her mind. The implications were staggering. If the perpetrator was using Chimera tactics, then they weren't just a random extremist. They were a sophisticated operator, possibly trained, certainly intelligent, and deeply dangerous. And they knew her. Or at least, they knew her work. This wasn't merely a case, it was an exorcism, a desperate attempt to contain the monster she had, however inadvertently, helped to unleash. The city's fear was a direct result of her intellectual legacy, and that realization galvanized her. She had to stop this, not just for the city, but for herself, to somehow atone for the ghosts of Chimera. The next step was clear, though terrifying. She had to dive deeper into the archives, into the buried records of Project Chimera, to find the source, the student who had become the master. Her internal conflict, the guilt versus the need to act, had finally found its resolution in grim determination. Aris was left with a profound sense of dread and personal responsibility. The past no longer a distant memory, but a living, breathing threat. The transition from a theoretical past to a violent present was complete. The city held its breath, but Aris knew this was just the overture. The real terror lay in the echoes she was beginning to hear, echoes that spoke of her own darkest creation, now weaponized and unleashed. She picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over a number she hadn't called in years. This wasn't just about stopping a bomber. It was about confronting a legacy she had tried to bury. The ghost in the machine wasn't just out there, it was inside her too, demanding an accounting. They say the past is a foreign country. For me, it was a classified black site, and someone just opened the gates. The latest blast, a calculated disruption of the city's power grid, wasn't just a physical attack, it was a psychological gut punch. No casualties, but widespread panic, and a chillingly familiar pattern of fear amplification. It was a direct challenge, a taunt aimed squarely at me. Detective Miller stood beside me, his face grim, surveying the flickering streetlights and the controlled chaos of first responders. "Another ghost, Aris?" he muttered, catching my eye. He was starting to get it, the invisible war being waged. Agent Davies, still clinging to protocol, was on a secure line, barking orders, oblivious to the deeper currents at play. I ignored them both, my gaze fixed on the subtle details of the grid failure, the precise nodes targeted. This wasn't random, it was a lesson taught by me, now weaponized. The perpetrator's actions were becoming more personal. The previous week, a small controlled detonation had occurred near the old military archives, a building I'd spent countless hours in during Project Chimera, a warning or an invitation. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. The only way to understand the present was to fully excavate the past, no matter how painful. My mind drifted back, a familiar ache starting behind my eyes. 1998. The desert sun beat down on the Tactical Psychological Operations Development Center, a euphemism for a windowless bunker buried deep in Nevada. Dr. Elias Vance, my mentor and co-creator of Project Chimera, gestured wildly at a whiteboard covered in flowcharts and psychological models. "Aris, the goal isn't just to influence, it's to reconstruct perception, to make the enemy question their own reality." His eyes, usually sharp, held a manic gleam that day. We were young, brilliant, and dangerously idealistic, convinced we could weaponize understanding itself. We believed we were creating a shield, not a sword. How naive we were. The concept of cognitive dissonance induction, a method to deliberately create conflicting beliefs to destabilize an individual's worldview, was our brainchild. Now, it was being used to destabilize a city. The irony was a bitter taste. I remembered the early simulations, the controlled environments where we tested our theories. Volunteer subjects, mostly disillusioned soldiers or those seeking a new purpose, were exposed to carefully crafted narratives designed to erode trust, sow doubt, and ultimately alter their decision-making processes. We called it adaptive psychological conditioning. The Ethical Review Board, a rubber stamp operation, had raised concerns, but the promise of a non-lethal weapon that could win wars without bloodshed was too tempting for the brass. General Thorne, my father, then a rising star in military intelligence, had personally championed our work. He saw the potential, the strategic advantage. I saw a way to save lives, to prevent kinetic conflict. The road to hell, they say, is paved with good intentions. One particular subject, a former intelligence analyst named Marcus, stood out. He was sharp, resilient, almost impervious to our initial attempts. Vance saw him as a challenge. I saw him as a human being pushed to his limits. We designed a prolonged, multi-layered influence campaign targeting his core beliefs. It worked, too well. Marcus broke, not violently, but subtly. He became paranoid, distrustful of everything, even his own memories. We discharged him, citing psychological unsuitability. I often wondered what became of him. Was he one of the ghosts I was now chasing? Back in the present, the city hummed with a low, anxious energy. The power outages were intermittent, unpredictable, designed to keep people on edge, to amplify rumors and fear. This wasn't about destruction, it was about control. The perpetrator was orchestrating a symphony of psychological terror, using the very notes I had composed. I needed to access the Project Chimera archives, the deep storage files, the ones that had been locked away, deemed too sensitive even for post-mortem review. My old access codes were long defunct, but I knew who to call. Colonel Hayes, now retired and living a quiet life in upstate New York, had been our liaison, the military oversight for Chimera. He answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with age. "Thorne, haven't heard from you in years. Figured you'd finally found peace." His tone was laced with a weariness I recognized. I cut to the chase, explaining the bombings, the familiar signatures. There was a long silence on the other end. "Chimera," he finally whispered, the name a curse. I knew this day would come. Some things, Aris, once unleashed, can't be put back in the box. He gave me a coded number, a back channel to the classified archives, a place he swore he'd never think about again. His reluctance was palpable, a testament to the darkness we had collectively buried. Accessing the archives was like stepping into a time capsule of my own moral compromises. Rows of dusty hard drives, microfiches, and handwritten notes filled the sterile, climate-controlled room. I found the files on Marcus, his psychological profile, the detailed logs of his conditioning, the observations of his slow unraveling. My own handwriting filled the margins, clinical observations mixed with increasingly desperate ethical concerns. Subject exhibiting severe cognitive fragmentation. Recommend immediate cessation of protocol. My pleas had been overridden. The program was too important, too promising. The military's insatiable hunger for an edge had trumped human decency. I discovered something else in Marcus's file, a coded message, a personal note he had managed to slip into his final report, a desperate cry for help, disguised as a technical observation. It was a quote from an obscure philosophical text, one we had discussed during his initial assessment, a shared intellectual curiosity. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. It was a message to me, a ghost from his past, now haunting my present. He had seen through our manipulations even as he succumbed to them. He was not just a victim, he was a survivor, and now, perhaps, a perpetrator. The next attack was different. It wasn't just a power outage, it was a targeted disinformation campaign, flooding social media with fabricated news stories, designed to incite panic and distrust in specific communities. The target wasn't just the city's infrastructure, it was its social fabric. This was Marcus. This was his revenge, honed and perfected. He was striking at the very heart of what we had tried to build within Chimera, the manipulation of perception on a grand scale, Miller and Davies were overwhelmed, grappling with the sheer volume of false information. "It's like fighting smoke," Davies exclaimed, frustration etched on his face. "Every time we debunk one story, 10 more pop up." I knew exactly what Marcus was doing. He was using the information cascade protocol, a high-level chimera tactic designed to overwhelm and disorient, making objective truth impossible to discern. I had to find him, not just to stop the bombings, but to confront the ghost of my own creation. The stakes weren't just the city's safety, it was my own soul. I used the coded quote Marcus had left, cross-referencing it with his known interests and the specific philosophical texts we had discussed. It led me to a forgotten online forum, a relic from the early days of the internet, a place where he had once posted under a pseudonym, discussing the very texts we had used against him. It was a digital breadcrumb left for me. The location wasn't a military base or a dark web hideout. It was a small, unassuming apartment building on the outskirts of the city, a place he had rented years ago, before Chimera, a place he had called his sanctuary. He wanted to be found, but on his terms. The bombings stopped. The disinformation campaign ceased. The city slowly began to breathe again, but the scars remained, invisible but deep. The fear, once unleashed, lingered in the collective consciousness. The echoes of Chimera might have faded, but the silence it left behind carried its own weight, a testament to the enduring shadows of war and the indelible marks of a troubled past. I had found Marcus, but the confrontation was yet to come, a reckoning not just for him, but for me, and for the very concept of weaponized psychology. This wasn't about bombs. It was about fear, weaponized with surgical precision, just like we taught them. The realization hit Aris with the force of a physical blow, not as a theoretical concept, but as a living, breathing threat. The perpetrator, this ghost from her past, was not just mimicking Chimera, they were embodying its darkest potential. Every piece of the puzzle, every carefully placed device, every chilling message left for the public, screamed of a mind steeped in the very doctrines she had once helped forge. The city held its breath, but Aris knew this was just the overture. The real terror lay in the echoes she was beginning to hear, echoes that now led directly to a derelict industrial district on the city's forgotten edge. The intel was thin, a whisper from a burner phone traced through 3 proxies, hinting at a disused factory, the old Monarch steel plant, as the next target, or, more accurately, the next stage of the psychological operation. Miller, his face grim, had secured a perimeter, but the FBI, specifically Agent Davies, was still pushing for a more conventional approach. Davies saw a terrorist. Aris saw a strategist, a twisted reflection of herself. "This isn't a hostage situation, Agent," Aris had stated, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. "It's a performance, and we're the audience. The objective isn't destruction, it's control, fear, weaponized with surgical precision, just like we taught them." Davies scoffed, but Aris ignored him, her gaze fixed on the grainy satellite image of the factory. She knew the layout, not from blueprints, but from the psychological profile of the man she was hunting. She felt him, a ghost in the machine, and she knew he was waiting for her. The air crackled with anticipation, a heavy silence broken only by the distant wail of sirens. The game was on, and Aris was stepping onto the board she herself had designed. Aris moved with a quiet intensity, Miller a silent shadow at her side. Davies, still skeptical, had been relegated to perimeter command, a small victory for Aris's unconventional approach. The Monarch steel plant loomed, a skeletal monument to forgotten industry, its corroded metal skin reflecting the pale moonlight. Inside, darkness swallowed sound, amplifying the metallic creaks and groans of the decaying structure. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every distant clatter a potential trap. Aris remembered the early days of Project Chimera, the sterile white rooms, the endless simulations. They had built scenarios like this, designed to break down a subject's perception of reality, to induce a controlled paranoia. Now, she was the subject. Miller's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rusted machinery, forgotten tools. "Any idea what we're looking for, Doc?" he whispered, his voice tight. "A signature," Aris replied, her eyes scanning the debris. "A message. He wants to be understood, not just feared." It was a core tenet of Chimera. Understanding the target's internal landscape was paramount to manipulating it. They found it in the old foreman's office, a single flickering monitor displaying a countdown timer, not to an explosion, but to a broadcast. A live feed showing the city's skyline, innocent and unaware. Below the timer, a cryptic message scrolled. "The truth is a weapon, and I've just loaded the chamber." Aris felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. This wasn't about bombs. It was about fear, weaponized with surgical precision, just like they taught them. The perpetrator wasn't just a former student. He was a master, twisting her own lessons into a terrifying new curriculum. She remembered Dr. Vance's lectures, his impassioned pleas for ethical boundaries, even as they pushed them further and further. Vance, who had left Chimera in disgust, unable to reconcile the program's potential for good with its inherent capacity for harm. Aris had stayed, convinced she could control the monster they were creating. Now, the monster was loose, and it was speaking her language. Miller gestured to a series of pressure plates on the floor, barely visible beneath a layer of dust. "Booby traps?" "Psychological deterrents," Aris corrected, stepping carefully around them. "Designed to make us hesitate, to question our every move, to erode trust, even between us." She recalled a specific Chimera exercise, the maze of mirrors, where participants were forced to navigate a seemingly simple path, only to find every choice led to a dead end or a perceived threat, all designed to induce learned helplessness. This was the real-world application. They moved deeper into the plant, the air growing colder, the silence more profound. Aris's mind raced, piecing together the perpetrator's movements, his likely vantage points. He was observing them, testing them, enjoying the psychological dance. She remembered a young recruit, Private Jensen, during a Chimera simulation. Jensen, bright, eager, a natural at pattern recognition. He'd excelled at the influence operations module, the one Aris had designed. He'd understood the subtle art of persuasion, of planting an idea so deeply it felt like one's own. He'd been dismissed from the program after a psychological incident, details classified. Could it be him? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. They reached a central control room, overlooking the main assembly floor. The monitor here was larger, displaying multiple feeds, the city skyline, a news channel reporting on the ongoing bomb threats, and a live feed from inside the plant itself, showing Aris and Miller. He was here. He always had been. "Hello, Aris," a voice crackled from hidden speakers, distorted, yet eerily familiar. "Welcome back to class." It was Jensen, not Private Jensen, but Dr. Jensen, a man who had taken her lessons and refined them into a terrifying art form. His voice, calm and measured, spoke of betrayal, of the program's abandonment, of the government's hypocrisy. He wasn't just a victim. He was an avenger, using the very tools designed to control minds to expose the system that had broken his. Aris felt a surge of cold anger, mixed with a profound sense of failure. She had created him in a way. She had given him the tools, and the motive had been supplied by the very system she had served. "Jensen," Aris said, her voice steady, projecting it towards the hidden speakers. "This isn't the way. You're hurting innocent people." "Innocent?" Jensen's distorted laugh echoed through the cavernous space. "There are no innocents, Aris, only pawns and players. And you, my dear mentor, taught me how to play." He began to detail his plan, not for an explosion, but for a mass panic. A coordinated psychological attack delivered through the city's media channels, timed to coincide with a manufactured threat. A citywide maze of mirrors, where fear would be the weapon, and every citizen the subject. It was brilliant, terrifying, and undeniably her own creation, perfected. Miller moved to cut the power, but Aris stopped him. "No, that's what he expects. We have to play his game, but rewrite the rules." She remembered a counter-tactic from Chimera, cognitive reframing, designed to disrupt an opponent's psychological narrative by introducing an unexpected element, forcing them to adapt, to improvise, and in doing so, reveal their true intentions. She looked at the countdown timer, then at the city skyline on the monitor. She had to break his narrative, not just stop his attack. The countdown timer ticked relentlessly, each second a hammer blow against Aris's resolve. Jensen's voice, now laced with a manic glee, described the final phase of his operation. He wasn't just planning to trigger panic, he was orchestrating a mass psychological breakdown, designed to expose the fragility of societal order, a twisted vindication of Chimera's darkest theories. "The truth is a weapon, Aris," he repeated, his voice rising, "and I'm about to fire." Aris knew she had one chance. She looked at Miller, who nodded, his hand hovering over his sidearm, ready for whatever she needed. "Jensen," Aris projected, her voice calm, cutting through his monologue. "You're right, the truth is a weapon. But you're using a blunt instrument. You're trying to break the system. I'm going to expose it." She began to speak, not to Jensen, but to the hidden cameras she knew were broadcasting to him, to the city, to anyone who might be listening. She spoke of Project Chimera, of its origins, its ethical compromises, its abandonment. She laid bare the very secrets Jensen was trying to weaponize, but she reframed them. She didn't glorify, she didn't excuse, she confessed. She confessed to her own involvement, her own moral failings, the hubris of thinking they could control such power. She spoke of the human cost, not just to Jensen, but to all the subjects, all the participants, all the soldiers who had been exposed to its insidious influence. It was a cognitive reframing on a grand scale, a direct attack on Jensen's narrative of victimhood and vengeance. She was taking his weapon, the truth, and turning it against the very system that had created it, but without the chaos he sought. She was offering accountability, not just destruction. Jensen's voice faltered, then erupted in a furious roar. "You think that changes anything? You think a confession absolves you?" The monitors flickered, and suddenly, Jensen appeared on one of the screens, his face contorted in rage, but also in a flicker of something else: confusion. He was in a control room on the floor below, a labyrinth of wires and old computer terminals. He had been so focused on his grand performance, he hadn't anticipated her counter-narrative. This wasn't about bombs. It was about fear, weaponized with surgical precision, just like we taught them. Aris saw her opening. "It changes everything, Jensen, because I'm not just exposing the system, I'm exposing us. And that's something you never dared to do." As she spoke, Miller, following a subtle signal, moved with practiced efficiency. He didn't go for Jensen directly. Instead, he targeted the main power conduit leading to Jensen's control room, an old, exposed fuse box Aris had spotted earlier. A quick, decisive shot, and sparks flew. The screens went black. The countdown timer froze. The silence that followed was deafening, a sudden, jarring absence of Jensen's voice, of the ticking clock, of the city's anxious pulse. The psychological attack had been disrupted, not by force, but by a carefully orchestrated act of intellectual warfare and a well-placed bullet. Jensen, momentarily stunned by the sudden blackout and the collapse of his carefully constructed reality, emerged from his control room, blinking in the sudden glare of Miller's flashlight. He was disoriented, his grand performance shattered. He raised a hand, not in surrender, but in a gesture of bewildered defeat. Aris had won the intellectual battle, but the cost, she knew, was immense. The aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, uniformed personnel, and the low hum of official vehicles. Jensen was taken into custody, his grand design unraveling under the harsh glare of reality. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief, unaware of the full scope of the psychological attack they had narrowly avoided. Aris, however, felt no triumph. The silence that followed carried its own weight, a testament to the enduring shadows of war and the indelible marks of a troubled past. She had stopped the immediate threat, but the ghost of Project Chimera still lingered, a specter of ethical compromise and unforeseen consequences. Agent Davies, surprisingly, offered a grudging nod of respect. "You saved a lot of lives today, Doctor, even if I don't understand half of what you did." Miller simply clapped her on the shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their shared ordeal. The official reports would be sanitized, the true nature of Jensen's attack and Aris's methods, buried under layers of classified jargon. The public would remember a foiled terror plot, not a psychological war waged with her own creations. Aris knew the truth. She had confronted her past, not just in the form of Jensen, but within herself. The catharsis was partial, incomplete. The burden of knowledge, of what she had created, remained. She had walked through the fire, but the scars she knew would never truly fade. The question of accountability, for Chimera, for Jensen, for her own role, hung heavy in the air. a question without an easy answer. She had done what was necessary, but the moral ambiguity of her actions, then and now, would forever be a part of her. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange, Aris walked out of the Monarch steel plant, leaving behind the wreckage of Jensen's ambition and the echoes of her own past. The city was waking, oblivious, ready for a new day. But for Aris, the world had fundamentally shifted. The uniform may be gone, but the scars of command and the weight of what I created never truly fade. She was still a profiler, still driven by a desire to understand the darker corners of the human mind. But now she carried a new purpose, a quiet determination to ensure that the tools of psychological warfare, her tools, would never again be turned against the innocent or against the very fabric of society. The path ahead was uncertain, but she would walk it, one step at a time, forever haunted, forever vigilant, a guardian against the ghosts she herself had helped create. Thank you for listening to the story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. See you soon.